Nina, good morning. Thank you for joining us. Well, let's just get started with these questions because you have so much fascinating information for these good people. You've spent more than 2 decades investigating the science behind saturated fats and seed oils, but you've also been very involved in the politics of the dietary guidelines. For the past decade, I know you've been very busy working on both nutrition policy in DC and earning a PhD in nutrition. How have you managed to balance all of this?
Well, I mean, all these fields really intersect, right? And so I started off just curious about what made us healthy, and like so many of you out there, and was just read thousands of scientific papers and spent a decade doing research for my book. And one of the things you realize is all the dietary advice that we've been given that is mistaken or misguided or just flat out wrong, it comes about because of this policy that we have, right? And it all comes from the top down, and when we go to our doctors and we can't get informed. So it's just my curiosity led to the research, led to wanting to get a PhD to really have some credibility in the field, and then that leads to policy. Like, how can we change it to make the advice out there more credible and better for everybody?
Well said.
Your journey really is compelling, Nina. And from your research then, what would you say would be some of the most striking examples of how industry has failed us and science that's flawed has really kind of shaped our national healthcare landscape?
I think one of the most astonishing stories that I know, I discovered with the very first recommendation to avoid saturated fat and cholesterol. So that's like why we think meat and butter and cheese are all bad for our health. That came out of the American Heart Association in 1961. And I discovered that that group had been launched by the seed oil industry, by Crisco Oil, because Procter & Gamble, maker of Crisco Oil, had organized a fundraising contest for them. And it really launched them. And then they turn out to say, cut back on saturated fats, replace them with seed oils. I mean, that's sort of the foundation of all the bad dietary advice that we had today, and it really began with the influence of industry.
Nina, the original food pyramid, which the AHA I know preceded the original food pyramid, but still we're coming up on about 50 years of it. It put grains, of course, at the base. It was a foundational thing. And then fats were right up at the top. In other words, don't touch these things was the overall view. Naturally, that created a very carb-heavy food marketplace that we still see today. With all of that in mind, what would be some practical advice that you'd give people to help them thrive metabolically? Because in the midst of this carb-heavy culture, of course, has come tremendous disease. But those are also the cheapest and sometimes yummiest foods. So what advice would you give people to help them break that habit?
I mean, I feel like that food pyramid is one of the most destructive graphics documents in the history of the world. And I would take the food pyramid, my advice would be, take the food pyramid and flip it upside down. Yeah. That would be, I think you all know, grains up at the tip, fat and protein down at the bottom, and that is the simplest and easiest and best advice I could give for improving somebody's metabolic health.
So just basically flip the pyramid.
Flip the pyramid.
Yeah.
I think, there's a South Park episode where they actually flip the pyramid. They're like in some control room.
I wasn't going to say it.
And it's just like, how did they know?
Yeah.
I mean, this is,
they thought it was just a joke.
Decades ago, right.
And they nailed it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, Nina, it's so compelling that many people are now starting to appreciate the fact that, we do need to be more thoughtful about our choices, and, we need to reevaluate these guidelines. So with recent federal initiatives that are proposing updates to these dietary guidelines and a change in food policy, what do you see as some of the most important changes that are on the horizon, and what do we still need to do in addition?
Yeah, I've been doing some work in Washington, D.C. on this, and just for everybody to understand, the dietary guidelines is it's like America's, the North Star of nutrition. It's the key influencer on what people think is a healthy diet, even if you think that's a .gov website. I don't go there. But it comes through your doctor, your dietitian, your nutritionist. It comes through the school education. It comes through, it's what we're fed. It's all school lunches are based on the guidelines, so they're super important. What needs to change? Currently, They still recommend 6 to 7 servings of grains every day, including 3 servings of refined grains. How can that be justified? And they still have a 10% of calories cap on saturated fats, which is why we can't, or our children can't get fed enough meat and eggs. There's no eggs for breakfast at school.
Right.
So that is probably those 2 changes are the single most important changes, I think, for improving metabolic health of America. I would also say getting rid of any cap on sodium.
Well said. In fact, I've heard you make a comment before about how it's easier for, you mentioned school lunches, how it's easier for a child to get chocolate milk than it is to just get whole milk or even 2% milk.
It is illegal to give away whole milk.
Illegal.
Illegal. You can, there were a bunch of dairy farmers who tried to give away whole milk at a school in Pennsylvania, and they were told, go down the street and you can give it away at a parking lot across the street from the school, but it's illegal to even give it
Remarkable.
away.
Yeah, that's sobering.
These kids only get non-fat or 1% milk, and then they add sugar to it for chocolate and strawberry milk because the kids don't want, tasteless, watery milk.
Yeah.
So that really has to change, I think, for our whole country to be healthier. We need to give kids a good start in life.
Yeah, in fact, let me ask one more because we're doing fine here. You'd mentioned to me before where I was with you in D.C. not too long ago, and I was struck, maybe just share briefly your thoughts on why it matters that the dietary guidelines, that inverted food pyramid, should be inverted, is coming from a department that really has no business, whose prime mandate is not human health. What is the USDA's job to create a food pyramid ought to be perhaps the purview of some other department.
Yeah, I think most people don't understand this. Like, we have this U.S. Department of Agriculture, the mission of which is to promote all American farmers and foods, right? And then, starting about 40 years ago, they're given this mission of the dietary guidelines to tell Americans, well, eat some of these foods and less of those foods, or they have to pick and choose between the foods. That's an inherent conflict of interest, right, in the agency. They can't be trying to promote all foods and then telling you don't eat these foods. And that whole agency, I mean, not to be too much of a cynic here, but they're heavily influenced by the grain industry. They're heavily influenced by the ultra-processed food industry. I actually did a systematic review of all the conflicts of interest on the expert committee that is in charge of the dietary guidelines. I don't know, what % of the committee do you think had a conflict of interest with food or pharma? I don't know, I'm sure you wouldn't guess it up here. 95% of that committee has a conflict of interest with food or pharma, most often the big multinational processed food companies like Unilever, Nestle. And then going back to why you think grains are at the bottom of the pyramid, Kellogg's, General Mills, those are the most common conflicts of interest. So half the committee had 30 such ties or more. One of the members of the committee, this is a 20-person committee, experts, she had 152 ties with food or pharma, right?
Oh my gosh, we have got our work cut out for us. Nina, thank you. Well, let's move on as we wrap up into some rapid fire questions.
Okay.
All right, question number 1. Yeah.
I'm feeling the heat. I feel it.
Yeah, you feel the heat. Yeah. You guys, this is what happens on stage when you have 2 sexy bald men. Things get really hot.
I got hair for both of you.
Okay, Nina can barely breathe being around 2 manly men. Okay, Nina, rapid fire. What are your top 3 foods that you aim to eat every day just to feel better?
Okay, I know this is controversial to some, but beef. I try to eat beef or meat from any ruminant animal. Why ruminant? Because they have multiple stomachs, and that is a chance to get rid of all the toxins in the plants that they eat. And when I learned that, I was really amazed. Like, it's different than a chicken or a pig that has 1 stomach. So beef, which is the most common ruminant meat we have, eggs, and butter. Butter has an amazing amount of vitamins in it, including vitamin K. I love butter.
Yep, awesome. Okay, next one. What would you suggest if someone wants to cut out just one thing to improve their diet?
I would have to say total carbohydrates. I know it's sort of more in the mode now to say just refined carbohydrates, and I think those are especially bad. But if you look at the scientific literature, if you have tipped over into metabolic ill health, you have obesity, diabetes, hypertension, the science shows that it's really the reduction of total carbohydrates that reverses you out of disease.
Wonderful. Nina, thank you so much for joining us. This
Thank
was
you for
great.
having
Please
me.
join me in thanking Nina.
Thank you.